Welcome to the deep dive. This is where we take your source material, could be articles, research notes, whatever you've got, and we really dig into it, find the core of what matters, basically give you that shortcut to being properly informed.
Yeah, cutting through the noise.
Exactly. So today we're diving into a specific piece of state legislation. It's HB 6017.
Right, one aiming to repeal subsection 8.
That's the one. And specifically, we're looking at the political situation after the governor vetoed it. Our mission here is to unpack the analysis you've brought us, the perspective in these sources.
And it offers a, well, let's say a unique take, maybe even surprising, on whether a veto override is actually likely.
It definitely seems counterintuitive at first glance.
It really does.
Yeah.
Because it's a classic case, I think, of political dynamics where what you see on the surface, it can be really misleading.
Oh, absolutely. Because, I mean, initially, just looking at the numbers, this bill, HB 6017, it seemed like it had, well, huge support. It passed the Senate 33-4.
Which is, I mean, that's a massive margin in any legislature. Looks like a slam dunk.
Totally. And the source material points out that seeing that 33-4 number, well, it got a lot of the repeal advocates feeling pretty confident.
Understandably so.
Yeah, thinking, okay, an override, that's possible, maybe even probable. It looks like a clear mandate.
It does. And look, that's a perfectly natural conclusion if you only look at that final vote tally.
And here's the quest. The analysis in your source argues that number. It's deceptive.
Exactly. Your perspective, the one laid out in these documents, it really stands apart from a lot of others who, desperately wanted this repeal.
Right. Despite that big 33-4 win, this analysis you shared concludes an override won't happen.
And what's really fascinating is how the source gets there. It zeroes in on one very specific detail that's kind of hidden beneath that big, flashy final vote.
A detail that changes the whole picture.
Completely flips the prediction.
Okay, so that's the core question for this deep dive then. Why does this analysis read the whole political chessboard so differently? What's this overlooked detail in your sources that makes such a difference?
Let's get into it.
All right, let's unpack this. So, yeah, 33-4. On its face, that looks compelling. It screams momentum, widespread support.
You'd think?
But the analysis in your source, it directs our attention somewhere else. It points to a different vote, one that happened earlier.
That's right, and argues that's the vote that really matters.
And what vote was that?
It was the vote on an amendment to the bill, specifically an amendment that tried to add caps on non-economic damages.
Ah, the caps amendment. Okay, and that amendment failed, right?
It did fail. But, and this is crucial, the vote wasn't some blowout. It was incredibly narrow, 18-19.
Wow. Okay, one vote difference.
Exactly. And this is where the source says the real story lies. It calls that 18-19 vote on the caps amendment the two canary in the coal mine.
Not the big 33-4 final vote.
No. That 18-19 vote, that's the signal, the warning sign others might be missing.
A canary in the coal mine. Okay, so indicating some underlying trouble or weakness.
Precisely. The analysis suggests this razor-thin vote reveals something absolutely critical.
Which is?
Which is that 18 senators who ended up voting for the final bill, HB 6017, those same 18 senators also preferred to have caps included.
Interesting. So they voted yes on the bill, but they actually wanted it with caps.
They supported the idea of repeal, yes. But ideally, they wanted that repeal package with limits on damages. That was their preference.
Okay, so this complicates that 33-4 number significantly.
Hugely.
It means those 33 votes for final passage weren't necessarily 33 votes fully committed to an override without the caps included.
That is the absolute critical distinction the source makes. It argues pretty convincingly based on this that at least 14 of those 33 senators, they might very well defect when it comes time for an override vote.
Defect? Why?
Because they won't support overriding the governor's veto unless caps are added back in somehow. They need that political cover.
Ugh, the political cover angle. Okay, let's look at the override math then, based on that theory. An override needs a 2/3 vote.
Correct.
In a 40-member Senate, 2/3 is 27 votes.
27 votes needed. Now, if the source is right, and you have 14 of the original 33 supporters peeling off because there are no caps.
You subtract 14 from 33, that leaves only 19 votes for the override.
19 votes, when you need 27.
That's 8 votes short.
8 votes short. The assessment from your source is pretty blunt on this. It just says, game over.
Wow. Okay, that is a starkly different picture than the 33-4 vote suggested. And the analysis ties this back to the governor's power.
It does,
Mm.
absolutely. The source highlights the practical political reality for these legislators. Well, the governor's got, what, 2 or 3 years left in his term?
Yeah.
That office holds significant power, real power.
Like over budgets, appointments?
Budgets, appointments, political endorsements,
Yeah.
maybe even influence down the line on things like redistricting. It's a lot of leverage.
So, for a senator, voting to override the governor isn't just a simple policy decision.
Not at all. The source actually frames it as career calculus.
Career calculus, meaning they're weighing the political cost.
Exactly. Legislators are, understandably, hesitant to cross the governor, to really sour that relationship on a contentious issue like this, unless they have strong political protection.
Which, in this specific case, the source argues, would have been the inclusion of those caps.
Precisely. The caps give them cover back home, maybe with certain lobbying groups or industries too. Without the caps, overriding the veto becomes a much riskier vote for many of them.
And that failed amendment vote, the 1819 against caps, that reinforces this point.
It does. It showed that only a very, very narrow majority actually favored uncapped liability when push came to shove on that amendment.
So those 18 senators who voted for caps, even though they lost narrowly,
The source calls them the medical lobby's firewall. Their preference for caps was clear, and critically, they have the numbers, or at least enough potential defectors among them, to block an override attempt that doesn't include caps.
how many defectors would it take again?
Well, remember, the override needs 27 votes. They start with maybe 33 potential yeses. If just 4 of those 18 senators who preferred caps decide they won't override without them.
4 defectors is enough to kill it.
If the base of truly committed override votes is only around 19, 20, 33, minus the potential 14 defectors, then yeah, losing even a few more makes it impossible. The source calculates that if just 4 of the 18 caps-preferring senators defect from the override vote, it fails.
Okay. And according to the analysis you've provided, this is where the advocates pushing for the override are, well, misreading the room.
That's exactly what the source argues. They're taking that big 33-4 final vote at face value. They're mistaking what the source bluntly calls political theater.
Political theater.
Yeah, mistaking theater for genuine, locked-in commitment to an override without caps.
How does the source define political theater here? What did that 33-4 vote really represent then?
The source basically characterizes it as a vote for a symbolic doomed bill.
Doomed because?
Because, according to the source, most people knew the governor was likely going to veto it anyway. He'd already signaled it. So voting yes on final passage allowed senators to look compassionate on the issue.
Signal support to constituents.
Right. Signal support, look good, without actually having to face the political heat of defying the governor or truly enacting uncapped liability, which many of them might have been nervous about anyway.
So it was a low-cost symbolic vote for many.
That's the argument, the strategic vote, the one that showed where people really stood when there were consequences. That was the narrow 1819 amendment vote on caps.
So the final vote was optics. The amendment vote revealed the real political fault lines.
You got it. That's the core of the analysis.
And the source warns that actually attempting an override based on misreading these numbers, that could backfire on the advocates.
Yeah, the analysis suggests they're setting themselves up for failure, and that could have some pretty significant negative consequences.
Like what? What does the source say could go wrong if they push for an override and fail?
Well, several things. First, it could publicly expose these intra-caucus divisions, make the splits within the party or legislature very obvious.
Which is never good.
No. It could also be politically embarrassing for the bill's main sponsor. But maybe more importantly, the source warns it could create hardened opposition for next year's legislative session.
Making it harder to pass anything on this issue later.
Exactly. The source calls pushing for a doomed override now a potential critical mistake for the long game. It might also tick off some moderate legislators.
How so?
Well, moderates who might have been open to some kind of negotiated repeal, maybe one that did include caps as a compromise, they might get alienated by this all-or-nothing override push.
Okay, so pulling this all together then, the unique position laid out in your source material is essentially that this veto override is, well, it's just not going to happen.
Mathematically and politically improbable is the phrasing used.
Mathematically and politically improbable.
Right. And the source suggests that the realistic path forward isn't this doomed override attempt. It's going back to the drawing board for next session.
And crafting what? A different bill?
A refined bill is how the source puts it.
Mm-hmm.
One that tries to balance the goal of accountability with, political feasibility.
And feasibility in this context almost certainly means...
It likely means including reasonable non-economic damage caps as a necessary compromise to actually get something passed.
Gotcha. And the source had some pretty pointed words for the advocates who insisted on a clean repeal or nothing, didn't it?
It did. The analysis concludes pretty bluntly that those hardliners are now on track to get nothing again.
Ouch.
Yeah. It argues they refused to negotiate earlier, potentially refusing what the source refers to as a $1 entire cap compromise when they might have had a chance to get something.
And the result?
The result is zero standing restoration for families this year and a vetoed bill going nowhere.
Wow. The source really frames that as a strategic failure.
It uses the phrase having traded tactical progress for ideological purity.
That's a tough assessment.
It is tough, but it's grounded in the specific vote counts and the political analysis laid out right there in your source material.
Okay, so let's step back. What does all this mean for you, the listener? I think this deep dive into your sources really shows that understanding political outcomes, man, it requires looking beyond just the obvious numbers, the headlines.
Definitely. You've got to try and spot the strategic calculations, find those hidden indicators, like that really narrow amendment vote we talked about.
Yeah, that vote completely changed the reading of the situation.
It highlighted how that seemingly overwhelming 33-4 support for HB 6017 on the final vote was, well, according to this analysis, a misleading signal.
A mirage, almost.
Kind of. The real indicator, the source argues, of support for an override without caps was hidden in that different earlier vote.
And so the surprising conclusion this analysis leads to, the override is highly unlikely.
Yeah. Improbable. Because that key group of senators, the ones who voted yes on the bill but really wanted caps, the political cost of crossing the governor without that cap cover is just too high for enough of them.
They won't make the jump to 27 votes.
The math doesn't add up, according to this perspective.
So this dive really shows how, unpacking different legislative moments, understanding the political dynamics underneath, it can reveal a completely different story than what you might just see on the surface.
Absolutely. It really underscores the difference between, say, a symbolic vote meant for show and a vote driven by hard strategic or political calculation.
Definitely food for thought.
Right.
Which leads us to our final provocation for you to consider.
Okay.
If a single vote on an amendment like the one we discussed today can be the real indicator of political will, hiding the true story, well, what other legislative processes or maybe even other kinds of votes out there might have their true meaning hidden in plain sight, just waiting for you to uncover them?